Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Conversations with Lynn McTaggart. And today I have the most special guest of all. She is an amazing spiritual activist. She was one of the early ones. She's started peace movements. She's started early activist movements like the Angel Food Project. She's been a best-selling author of many, many New York Times bestsellers, and most recently, a candidate for the US presidency. Welcome, Marianne. And the other thing about it is she's a dear friend of mine.
Hey, Lynn, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate being here.
Thank you. Well, look, we're going to talk about spiritual activism because that's been something you've been your entire life. And we've all seen some of the struggles that are involved in trying to change the system. First of all, what made you become a spiritual activist? What was the spark?
Well, first of all, when I think of spiritual activism, that's inside my own head and heart. You know, Martin Luther King said, don't mistake our material passivity for weakness. He said, we are materially passive, but we are spiritually active. I think spiritual activism begins with rethinking our lives and rethinking the world. But then there comes a point, you know, it's that constant yin and yang. And when you look at the yin and yang sign, they are always melding into one another, right? It's the paisley, right? It goes into one another. There's the inhale and the exhale. And a wholesome life, meaning whole person, a balanced life is one in which neither the internal nor the external takes precedence, but rather we take responsibility for both what's happening within and what's happening without. And it does begin with what's happening inside. You know, I once saw a piece of graffiti. It said, to be, what was it? To be is to do, Goethe, to do is to be, Schopenhauer, doobie-doobie-doo, Sinatra. You know, it's always that question, is it about being or is it about doing? And I think the 21st century is about both. I think where the spiritual community has it right is we realize it has to begin with the inside. But this is what happens because the shadow will use anything. So you can be on the right path, have really rethought your own life. And then the ego mind would have us think, well, that's all you have to do because that's where it all begins. But actually, I think that when we think of what the activism of the 21st century is that will really change the world, is not where we say something like, well, all I can do is change myself. You don't get to get away with that when you're living in an advanced democracy because it's simply untrue. And so then the issue is everything that all of us in the higher consciousness community have been doing for decades now in order to establish and to articulate the principles of right living. Now it's about applying those same principles, not coming up with anything new, but applying those principles to the world. So for that, we don't really need more data collection, we need courage. And so when you say, what made me want to do the political dance? First of all, I really understand, I've read enough of American history to see how metaphysical, you know, if you look at the Great Seal of the United States, it's on our dollar bill, Lynn. It's the Great Pyramid at Giza with the capstone returned with the Eye of Horus on it and Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. You know, those guys were Masons. In those days, astrology, masonry, all of those things were just considered gentlemanly arts. Our founders designed that. So I've always been fascinated, and I read that book. I wrote that book, Healing the Soul of America, and then Politics of Love. Once I started reading, I started realizing how the intersection of metaphysics, spirituality, and politics was not only present at the founding of our country, but then Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I'm like, oh my God, it's always been there. And then I would read about the abolitionist movement and how much it was based among white abolitionists in the early evangelical churches of New Hampshire. Then I read about how so many of the women who were head of the suffragist movement were Quakers, religious Quakers, and that's where the whole thing of women's suffrage came from, the equality of souls. Then I read about Dr. King and read more into his being a Baptist preacher and how that worked for him, that he moved from the pulpit to the streets. And I was like, oh my God, this is nothing that has to be new. It just has to be reactivated. Well, the modern higher consciousness movement, because I saw this in my own career, because I was here at the beginning, I was one of that original pod, and I'm sure many of your listeners were part of that original pod as well. And because when my career began, AIDS was right in front of me. Life just put it there. So for me, my work teaching the Course in Miracles and all of that about internal change was never separated from human suffering, because the AIDS crisis burst. So to me, the two were married, trying to live from greater love and higher consciousness, and the fact that the sufferer is in front of you. And if you do not respond to that, what is all this talk about love? Well, I went away for a few years. I was working in Michigan at a church there. I came, and when that period was over, I saw that this entire higher consciousness movement, which had been just this little countercultural pocket we were all in, Deepak and James Redfield, and it was a thing, and it was a beautiful, pure thing. Well, it had discovered capitalism, and all of a sudden, it had become a business. And one of the things that I saw was that it so often was about, it was very apolitical. It was about protect your brand now, protect your brand. Don't say anything that might offend anybody. And I thought, wow, this is so strange. Shouldn't we be, and I used to say to so many of my colleagues, the Jews, the Catholics, the Christians, they found hospitals and they found, all these nonprofits that help people. Isn't that what we should be doing? And certainly there were and are many who do. Don't get me wrong. There are many, a lot. But we, for the most part, developed in a way that was just very apolitical, keep it very non-controversial. And I went, oh, wow. Well, there will be a real limit to the effect we can have on the culture. Because, so then when I went, I felt that so many of the things that I had seen early in my career, people had cancer, people had been diagnosed with a life-challenging disease, their child is addicted, a loved one died. It has been a privilege, and I think the community has been very good at showing up for people in times of great need and stress, such as that. But what I began to see about 20 years ago was how much of the crises that I saw in people and encountered in my work were crises that were at least indirectly caused by bad public policy. They didn't have health care. They were depressed because they had to work 3 jobs. They didn't see where they'd ever be able to afford a house or children. And I began to realize, oh my God. And the Course in Miracles talks about how you can't bring the light to the darkness. You have to bring the darkness to light. And God sends his people into various areas where we can be the presence of a light-filled alternative. That's how it started. And that's how it went for me. And I, having now run for president twice, know about that darkness on levels that I think would actually disturb most people if they knew how it really works.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have something in common in that I've been looking at the dark side of medicine for now 30-something years. And I never believed I was going to see what I saw.
That's exactly.
We not only found that most drugs haven't actually been studied, but then when we went deeper, and this isn't weird dark web conspiracy, this is stuff coming out of medical journals, things like 3/4 of all drug trials are fake. They are written up by PR agents. There are particular agencies that offer to do the writing of drug trials for drug companies. And this is standard practice. And as I say, this is medical journals reporting on this. And they will write up the study in some sort of spin. They'll get some expert in that area, a gynecologist, a heart doctor or whatever, to put his name to it, her name to it, and then massage the data until it looks good. That is our drug trials. So I was shocked by that. But then I was really shocked to see when we did stories for our magazine. For anybody who doesn't know, we've run a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You for over 30 years. And my husband, Brian, who works with me on it, did a story and investigated where Congress people were getting their funding. And he found, remember, we're only looking in drug money, pharmaceutical donations. And he found that every member of Congress, save a few people like Bernie Sanders at the time, were taking thousands of dollars from big pharma every single year, some people up to $500,000. And also, since when I started as a young journalist, I remember writing a story for the New York Times Magazine about the Food and Drug Administration, which had a particular department that was going after doctors who were falsifying drug trials. And these guys were heroes in the FDA. No more. I mean, since that time, really since the 80s, everybody in the Food and Drug Administration, everybody in the CDC has been replaced by ex-drug employees, drug company employees. So all of those government agencies meant to protect us are corrupt. All of those congressional people are taking money. So the question of whether or not they're really going to look out for the needs of people is minimal.
Yeah, if I had not run for president twice, I might not be as full on understanding what you're saying. It's not even difficult to research that. It's open knowledge. You can look at open secrets and you can see who paid what to what to what Congress people. The problem, as I see it now, is that I call it a political media industrial complex. You have a lot of mainstream media because they do represent part of that corporate matrix. It's a corporate matrix, which is what I talked about throughout my campaign. That corporate matrix, the mainstream media companies and the political parties themselves are part of the matrix. So it's not only the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies, such as you're talking about, the big food companies, the big chemical companies, the big agribusiness companies, the gun manufacturers, the big oil companies, the defense contractors. It's also the mainstream media that provides cover and creates these narratives. No, the bad people are the people trying to call you on your shit. Right?
Oh, yeah.
They're the bad people. They're the conspiracy theorists. Now, the interesting thing about conspiracy, there is a conspiracy, but it's not covert. It's actually overt. And if you point it out, then they make you bad. Oh, you're crazy. And I think if you're a woman particularly, it's that ancient old thing, that, oh, she's crazy if she doesn't toe the line. And then what I saw in my campaign is the part that the political parties play. But I have to, if I may, I want to say something interesting, because Lynn, you've been saying this kind of thing a lot. And the wellness community, the higher consciousness and wellness community has been willing to go there on health, and that's good. And you've been one of the main voices talking about it and so forth. But it's more than just health. And I think it's when you make the connection and see it's everything. It's the same thing when it comes to the environment. It's the same thing when it comes to foreign wars that we should not have fought. It's the same thing when it comes, and you do talk about this, of course, the carcinogens in our food. It's the same thing when it comes to so many issues. And it's when you see that the question does come up. Are we going to just talk about it in our comfortable silos? or are we going to do something about it? And if we're going to do something about it in any fundamental way, that does take political action.
But as you've seen, the dice are loaded now. I mean,
The
and
dice are very loaded, and that system will not disrupt itself.
no,
Mhm,
I mean,
mhm.
that, and as you say, the media are now complicit. Once again, back in the old days, the media held the government's foot to the fire, and no longer. I mean, the media are complicit and also are going after people trying to expose the truth. I mean, we've been at the sharp end of that. You know, we've had so many attacks on us in the mainstream media, from lobbyists paid for by big food, et cetera, et cetera. And we've had to fight back, but fight back as Jedi Knights, you know, on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And we've been able to do so successfully. But, you know, the dice is loaded. So as you say, we have to do something about it. But
Well,
it's very difficult to do it in a conventional way, as you saw. You've got this massive matrix. So,
yeah.
okay, now what? Now what?
Yeah, well, no, I don't let us off the hook quite like that. You say it's difficult to do. When you look at the amount of money and the amount of influential power that we have in our community, we could have done it with my presidential candidacy. So it's not, I mean, we can't act like we're so sophisticated and so smart in every other area. But then when someone from our community who names exactly what you're naming across the board actually runs for president, is it really so cool? Everybody went, oh, well, you know, no. I was just there, Lynn. I was just there and we could have done it. When you think of the power of money and influence that is in our community, it was a characterological issue is, do I want to say it and be unpopular with my base? Because what's happening here is that in the higher consciousness and wellness community, it is permissible to talk about it in terms of health and wellness, because to our community, that one's obvious. But when you look at it across the board, it took us into a place, and I've seen it twice now because I've run twice. So it's simply not true. You had one of your sisters who ran for president and could have, you know, and that's the truth. So
Okay,
when you
but
say
they
it's too
didn't.
hard to
They
take on, we could
didn't.
have taken on that.
Yeah, they didn't. They're not, you know, they're, as you say, they're protecting their brand, they're protecting their own interests. And I mean, that is a microcosm of what's happening across the board. And, you know, it's interesting. I was very interested by a study that, because I got into the power of intention really from skepticism in the early 2000s. You know, I was hearing a lot of stuff around me about manifestation and all of this. And in my heart, I'm probably still a skeptical journalist. And this is after watching, you know, thousands of people get healed in 10 minutes with Power of 8 groups, and, you know, this being magnified. But I was hearing all of this and I was thinking, well, what are we talking about here? And it was kind of an I want, I get mentality. You know, I want, I'm going to get it. And I was really interested by one study that showed it had two groups of people. And one group were essentially pleasure seekers who were in the I want, I get modality. And they had very comfortable, very affluent lives, all the holidays in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And when scientists looked at their immune system markers, they found that they were terrible. These people were perfect candidates for heart attacks, strokes, cancer, Alzheimer's. Wow. They were going to drop like flies. Then they compared them to another group who were not as affluent, but who were living a life of service. And these people had extraordinary, robust immune systems. These people were going to live forever. So that told me very early on about something really important and possibly missing, which was in our community, which is that whole idea of serious service, and now service in an active way. So let me ask you something about it. Okay, we've seen the dice are loaded. It takes billions to run for president now, and the war chest of some of the other people who are out there is in the billions. So you mentioned a couple of people early on: Gandhi, Martin Luther King, even the Quakers. They all started activist movements, spiritual activist movements with small groups. I mean, Gandhi liberated India from from Great Britain, by handing out spinning wheels to little communities and saying, you'll be free when you can create your own little industry. And Martin Luther King, a handful of people. What a, not only his voice, but his whole strategic thinking about freeing and equality, etc. The Quakers started out with small groups. So have you ever started to think about ground up work, grassroots work now?
Well, certainly my campaign was grassroots, obviously, but the point is that because money was not the factor for let's say Mahatma Gandhi. Obviously was the British. Don't get me wrong, I'm not minimizing the British colonial forces that were against him, but we're just talking about the specifics here of what it takes and what it doesn't take to gain political power in the United States. From it's a different situation. So grassroots, of course, my campaign was grassroots, and I'm sure that many of the people who are watching, who are American citizens, because only American citizens can do it, did send money to my campaign. However, in today's world, in order to gain the kind of political power, the system is rigged in such a way that unless you are talking about huge amounts of money, now I'm not talking about 3,000, I'm talking about 3 million. Right? We're talking about levels of money. The system is designed so that only those who have money or have access to big money can get anywhere near the pinnacles of power. My point to you, Lynn, is that everybody needs to grow up and get wise and stop pretending. Because when you're talking about the kind of money that exists in the wellness community, there are enough players in the wellness and the higher consciousness community who, if they had said, we need to raise millions to make it happen, could have done so.
But they didn't.
So
But they
I really,
yet.
whenever there's this like playing ditzy when it's convenient, I can't take it. We sell among us millions of books. I mean, there's an interesting thing about financial gain. With financial gain, and this has been lost in our society, and it really needs to come back. With financial gain comes power. And to a conscious person, with power comes responsibility.
Oh,
and
yes.
the wellness and higher consciousness community now has been, for a long time now, enough of a player in American capitalism and in the American economy and everybody found it very convenient to be ignored. Because we didn't have to, we could just do our own little thing and be loved. Believe me, I understand. I want to, I've been like, oh my God, I want to go back to the world in which I don't love and people are nice. I do understand that. But everything that you're talking about in terms of the food, the carcinogens, I was reading an article this morning about how there's this huge spike in advanced gastrointestinal cancers among young people that they never used to see. We know what's happening here. People like you are helping articulate it. What are we going to do? Because you're not going to do anything about it if you just say, well, everybody drink more green juice. I mean, these environmental factors that are everywhere. They're in the food, they're in the water. So it's very interesting because the wellness, and given our numbers, given the books we sell, and given the money that is generated, the system, theoretically, someone who represents that much financial and numerical power, the system would be granting more gravitas. But it gets away with making fun of us because we don't even want to be out there. We just want to be over here in our nice little community. Well, hello. And then what I saw running for president is the way they mocked me and derided me. This is not accidental. This is what they do. This is what they've been doing for centuries. Make it like she's crazy. And they've done it to you. And they've done, oh, don't listen to her. Because what I've said in terms of the whole thing is what you've said in terms of health, right? And
Mhm.
as you know, they come after you. Well,
Oh,
gosh,
yeah.
hello. When are we going to show up and say, you do it to my sister, you're doing it to me? This is what I have seen that's just really blown my mind. If the goddess is really going to rise, she's going to say, I've done it. This has got to stop now. Whereas Deepak? Deepak was very, he did an IG with me. Tony Robbins, I saw in a picture with Bobby Kennedy the other day. Oprah had made a comment, apparently she's for Biden. But I think the next time something like this happens, our community has got to decide, what I found, which really goes more into how women are treated and stuff. What I found running for president is if what they do, Lynn, is they make somebody radioactive. She's crazy. She's a nutcase. Her views on, and when you were talking before about experts, her views have been debunked by experts. Who are their experts? Their experts are them. Her
I know.
irresponsible views about health, her irresponsible views about mental health have been debunked by experts. Their experts are their PR people. So
I
then
know.
make someone radioactive, and then somebody's afraid if I put my name with hers, then I'll be radioactive too. And so you just
I've seen that. We've seen
walk to
that
the
for many
stake.
years.
Mhm, mhm.
And I mean, we saw it. We had a big situation like this with COVID. Now
Mhm.
we did the sensible middle, as I like to call it. We started covering everything about COVID and have written all kinds of things. And it looks like we called it right on every single aspect of COVID. But we had people in our community, Marianne, calling us, conspiracy theorists, which is exactly what we weren't. We were avoiding from all that dark web stuff and saying we were spreading misinformation. And these were people who had no idea what kind of scientific evidence we were looking at. But there was another aspect of it, which was attacking me as a woman. And that has happened for many years.
Yeah.
I even had my website hacked into with rape threats, not only for me, but my daughters, which was worrying. But most people who do stuff like that are, they're hiding behind their own anonymity. So I wasn't really worried, but
Yeah.
I had to go on the attack. And I did go on the attack on my Facebook pages. We even attacked journalists who were just writing rubbish about us and saying, you call that a story? We had to be aggressive back. But I think what you're talking about too is something so fundamental that I want to get into, which is we can't count on our community, unfortunately. As you said, our community is very comfortable and they've got used to making a decent amount of money. They don't want to rock the boat there. But we're all getting to a place now as we watch our leaders become worse and worse and worse, more and more corrupt, as we see all of those things that you were talking about, water, food, politics, etc., be corrupted by uber capitalism. As we see all of this happening, we know now that it's going to be very difficult to change things from the top down. The dice is loaded.
No. It's about money. No, it's not, it's almost convenient for us to think that. I was there. And if I had had more money, I could have stayed. Because the thing is, if first of all, let's go back to when you were talking about how journalists used to behave. I think a lot of the younger people don't have the institutional memory to know what happened. In 1996, under Bill Clinton, they passed what's called the Telecommunications Act. When I was a child, the same company was not allowed to own the newspaper and the radio and the television station in a community because it was codified into law that we guaranteed diversification of information. In the 1990s, with that Telecommunications Act, it provided for the monopolization of mainstream media into just a few companies, which had not been allowed before. That's why monopolies are so much a part of the way darkness operates here. So prior to that time, and also Ronald Reagan had gotten rid of the fairness doctrine, which meant you had to present the other side. During, when I was growing up, let's say there was a factory and the factory was spewing carcinogens into the river next to it. Now, 10 miles away, there might be a local newspaper, and that a journalist at the local newspaper would go to his or her editor and say, we've got something we need to investigate. The factory downriver is spewing known carcinogens. The editor of the paper was likely to say, great, get on it. And if it was a great series of articles, there's a good chance the paper and the journalist would get like a Pulitzer Prize. Okay, how did things change with the Telecommunications Act? The same company that owns the factory very likely owns the newspaper. So now, if that journalist comes and says to his editor or her editor, we need to look into that, the editor is more likely to say, no, we're not going to go there, even to the point of firing the journalist if they try. So then what happened, for instance, when I ran for president, is this time, and it didn't happen last time, because last time I did have a CNN town hall. I was on CNN and MSNBC pretty regularly. This time it was like, oh, don't let people hear her. I was blacklisted. It is unheard of that a person who is an FEC registered presidential candidate isn't on those platforms. I mean, I would have the same poll numbers as Nikki Haley. Hers was called a surge. Mine was something to ignore. And this is why everything you're saying, they don't want this conversation out there. All right.
No,
so that
they
means,
don't want this
hold on,
conversation.
please let me finish, because this is important for us to understand in terms of our community. There was one way to override that, and that's with bought media. It's all about the money. Why is it about the money? Because without the money, if they're not letting you on, because they don't want the public to hear this, you have to buy ads, you have to be able to buy television ads, you have to have more staff. And so you have to figure out what you want in life. If you want to take on that big system, then you have to show up with big power. And that means the power of people talking and people saying, even if it's the risk that this is ridiculous, this is what they're doing to these people because they're saying the truth, and it takes big money. And that's going to be the step that's going to liberate all of us, I think, in order to override it. Until we do that, it will just continue as it is, and that system will not disrupt itself. And that system is an invitation to fascism, make no doubt about it.
Oh, totally. I mean, I just came from Munich, and of course, being in Munich, which is where the Nazi Party started, I bought a book on Germany just to find out once again, how did Hitler come about? And of course, it came about with very similar circumstances, where we have a huge percentage of the population can't even feed themselves. You've been talking about that. With a huge percentage of the population can't heat themselves, can't afford their housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
It was exactly the same. And suddenly a strong man came along and said, I'll handle this.
Absolutely.
I mean, there were many other nuances that happened too to make that happen, but so it didn't happen. It didn't happen.
Well, but hold on, if I may go back.
And we're in agreement that it takes a ridiculous amount of money to make this happen, to run for president, and to also be, then there's the whole issue of that you identified of the media being complicit in wanting the system to remain as it is because of their shareholders, et cetera, and the whole of the Congress receiving all of this money from all of those lobbyists and all of those lobbying groups. So if it can't happen that way, let's try to explore ground up stuff, because you did run a grassroots campaign. And don't just shake your head on this one, because think about this for a moment. This is You yourself have talked about how
My
powerful.
campaign was a ground up campaign. My campaign was a grassroots campaign.
Yes, but all I'm saying is that it didn't happen. So let's explore what else we can do. Look at the power we have. Just consider this for a moment. Let's say, we're talking about medicine, let's say. And one of the things that the pharmaceutical industry depends on is new drugs. That's where they get most of their money. You know, drugs that have been invented, or they're mostly Me Too drugs. They're just like something that we've had before, but they call it a brand new drug. They make millions from it. Their shareholders make millions from it. What if we had a campaign? What if we just created a campaign saying to everybody, you know what? There's a drug, you're taking this drug, it's identical to X drug, which has been around 10 years longer. Let's all stop. Let's do this hypothetically for a while. We create a campaign that has people stop from taking anything that is newer than 5 years. Do you know what would happen to the pharmaceutical industry? Their shares would plunge. It would be an enormous statement. I'm making a total hypothetical statement just to show how powerful people power is. And thus it has ever been with history. I'm inviting you to think about, you've been on the ground, you've talked to so many people. What would be a grassroots campaign you could see that is other than you running for president? What could you start, you think, that might be effective?
I'm not naive about how this country works. Running for president was the platform for exactly what you're saying.
Okay, but if you can't do that now, you've just dropped out. What else do you think you could see?
What I can do is help people understand so that next time somebody does this, this stuff doesn't happen. That's what I feel like I can best contribute. It's for people to wake up and know that the next time someone is out there, that because everything you're saying is part of what goes along with it. You know, and of course you want to, but the thing is, like I said before, it's a matrix. It's not just the pharmaceutical companies. It's a cabal. It's an entire matrix, and it's an entire way that corporate power, at least in this country, I see you have some Europeans on this call. I see it in the chat. Europe, if you look at a big food company, I'm sure you're well aware of this. If you look at the ingredients in a ketchup bottle in the United States versus a ketchup bottle in Canada, the same company has to put different ingredients because in Canada and in Europe, there are far more protections against the inclusion of overtly carcinogenic ingredients in the food. In the United States, because they have discovered elements that would allow for a longer shelf life, even though they know that they are carcinogen, they put them in the food and they are allowed to. But the kind of agency capture that allows for that is no different in food than in anything else. So to me, I mean, you can, obviously take on whatever, you feel moved. Everybody should do what they feel moved. But ultimately, until you are willing to take this on in terms of a context of higher power, then and seeing the whole picture, then it's going to have, if you say one life, it was all worth doing. If you make a dent in any one industry, then by all means, go ahead.
Okay, let's look at something else now. Something that's interested me. Let's look at war. Something interested me that's been going on since I've been running intention experiments. And for people who don't know out there, I've been working with intention in large groups and small groups since around 2007. And I started out doing intention experiments to see how far we could take it. And I was working with and still work with scientists at a lot of prestigious universities who set up the experiments or measure them. And then I invite my readers around the world to send an intention to something. Most recently, we've done 3 intention experiments for Gaza and Israel. And we called for an immediate ceasefire, immediate release of all hostages. And, right after we did our 3rd one, there was the ceasefire. Did we do this? Who knows? It could be many factors. Maybe it was us, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. What was interesting to me, and it has been since I started in 2008, to survey people. I've surveyed participants in these intention experiments, basically to say, how was that for you? And since that time, and I was shocked to see this, there is an amazing rebound effect that happens to people when they do this. First of all, about 40% say their relationships are better. These are with the peace intention experiments. We've run about 11 or 12 of them to date. So about 40% of them say our relationships are better. They're getting along better with their estranged partners or their children, their not so nice boss. They also say that about half say that they are more in love with everyone they come in contact with.
Mhm.
Many of them have said, I'm quitting my job and I'm joining the Peace Corps or something like that. I want to work for peace. And about a third of them say that they're healed in some way. A situation that they have, a medical situation is improved, or, I had one diabetic recently who said type 1 diabetes, said my blood sugar is under control for the first time. Somebody else with terrible hip pain, I'm feeling better, I have no more pain, and so forth, all kinds of healings. The one that interests me the most is I'm more in love with everyone I come in contact with. Half of all people say this all the time. And they are, essentially hugging strangers. So I started thinking about this and doing a little math. Just imagine, we know this from the work of Harvard University, Nicholas Christakis, that people who have something, like do something good for someone else, that ripples down a social network by 3 degrees, meaning if Jim is nice to Nancy, Nancy's more likely to be nice to Bob, Bob's more likely to be nice to Tom, and Tom's more likely to be nice to Lois. And so it goes. So half of all people have felt more love when they come in contact. If that spreads down their social network and it's 50, say they know 50 people, then you have something like 4 million people who have been affected by that. If they know 150 people, another estimate of how many people we're in contact with, you have about half the population of Israel that are affected by this. And if everybody knows 600 people, you have about close to 1 billion people affected by this. So I start to think about affecting people, causing peace in a different way. And that's what I'm inviting you to think about is, yes, absolutely, we need to change something from the top. But what can people out there do that is going to be meaningful in terms of change? I've seen all kinds of changed lives with groups of 8 intention experiments, large groups of people where they're permanently changed and they change other people too.
Well, you don't need to invite me to think about something I've been talking about for 40 years. It's all metaphysical concept, whether you call it an intention experiment or a prayer group, it's all the same. It's the power of the use of the mind. The Course in Miracles says that an idea grows stronger when it is shared. And that's really what you're talking about, sharing an idea and the exponential power when you share the idea. So I never saw, to me, it's both inside and outside. And I always, I wish there had been an intention experiment when I was running for president. I mean, it's the same thing. It's everything you're saying, I totally believe is true, but that's all whether you contextualize it in secular terms as you do, or someone is contextualizing it in more spiritual terms, it's the same principle of the mind. The Course in Miracles says psychotherapy and religion at their peak are the same thing. It's how we use our mind. So once again, it's not about inviting me to think about this. My whole career has been based on this as well. And my desire and what you're talking about, like when you talk about Gaza, you're talking about how can we use the power of the mind to change the outer world. And I totally agree with you. But once again, it's not like I didn't get that. I was hoping for and working. I mean, there were so many people who were doing prayer groups and talking about that. But I also saw the power, Lynn. You know what's happening here in the United States? It's changing right now. There was this thought form. It has to be Biden. It has to be Biden. It has to be Biden. And we can't even allow ourselves to think about anyone but Biden. Now, all of a sudden, this report has come out, an official report, which whether this is cool or not that they did this, I'm not even going to go there. But that has suggested the president's cognitive decline. And all of a sudden, people feel permission to wonder, well, maybe we should have had a real primary and allow other people. So it's interesting when you're talking about this idea of the power of the mind and the intention experiment, because what I've found was that if there is how do I say this? It's like fear-based forces use that as well. And this idea that, oh, it has to be Biden, it has to be Biden, it has to be Biden, was such a force field. And that's what I kept bumping up against. You can't go hear her. And it was interesting, Lynn. It was kind of medieval. And I know every woman who's listening understands this. It's the old archetype of she's a crazy woman, you can't listen to her. She's a crazy woman, you can't listen to her. And this idea that you bump up against these force fields used the other way. So I'm all for everything you're saying. And we have to do it more and more, because the other way of looking at the world also uses this manufactured consent. You know, that's what a cult is. That's what Nazism was. That's what Hitler was. It was a force field of thought. And we're seeing some of that now, and that's what terrifies so many of us.
Yes.
That intention experiment for love. Absolutely.
Yes.
It really is forces of thought versus forces of thought. And that's what it means when people say how at the bottom it's all a spiritual battle, because on a certain level, dynamics that are at work are beneath the surface.
Yeah, thought doesn't have one particular morality. I mean, evil thought has worked in many cases, and Hitler is a perfect example. So I'm starting to think, though, about small groups and local communities and real bottom-up work and bottom-up change. I mean,
it's the same. I mean, my career has been filled with, talking to a group of 1,000 and then talking to groups of 10. That's what prayer groups are, which is just a spiritual term for the same thing. And I agree with you that sometimes, and I've always said this to people, never be afraid of small groups, because sometimes with a small group, you can go deeper. And on that quantum realm, size doesn't matter. That's why 2 or more, whenever there's an agreement between 2 people, that opens up a space. And whether it's joined by 10, right? I mean, we're talking beyond time and space at that point.
Sure, absolutely. Thinking about what people can do right here, right now, because we are all feeling terribly powerless. We sat with some people in Munich last weekend, and we all scratched our heads and said, do we know of any decent, good leaders in the world anywhere? And we couldn't think of one good leader. And we're having the same issue over here in Britain. There's a poor decision between the two coming up. And lots of people are feeling overwhelmed by everything we've been talking about, the corruption, the level of corruption, uber capitalism, and what it's done. So I've started thinking about small groups and what they can do in their neighborhoods, in their communities. I started a thing called the 8 Revolution, because I started thinking about, we need an army of, we need a little army of change makers to start working from at a community level. And then I started thinking, well, I probably have an army of change makers. There's tens of thousands of Power of 8 groups around the world. What if we got them together? So I started putting together some free tools that are on my website for people to take and to start using little group intention to start changing things in their community. And there are all kinds of tools that I offered to them. I want to explore that for a bit and start thinking about a few things that people can do. For instance, just to give one simple example, there are some communities who have started partnerships with gas and electricity because they don't like the big mega companies anymore. So they've created a partnership where everybody works together. I love another situation in the north of England where a guy basically, I can't remember his name anymore, but he was tired of the banks and what they were doing to small people. So he said, I think I'll set up a savings and loan. There's actually a film about him, and it's absolutely wonderful because he had started loaning people. He was a successful businessman. And if somebody in his community had a problem, and needed some money, his first person was somebody who needed money for a funeral, he loaned it to her. And then a few other people had a problem, he loaned them money. They always paid him back. And that's where he got his idea. And sure enough, he did set up his savings and loan and has a local community bank that isn't like all of the cowboy banks that we have, et cetera, who are faceless, who are debanking people and doing all sorts of horrible things like that. So I look at some of that and think, maybe this has to be the way forward for us now, that we have to start doing things in small ways in our communities. And I certainly see this with my Power of Eight groups. They produce miracles, whether it's miracles for each other, but they've also produced miracles for their communities. Stopped fires, stopped droughts, done all kinds of things like that. Any thoughts about that? I know you've done this for
Well, I
decades.
think that that's very important, but it's both and. When you said a couple minutes ago, you were in Munich and people felt powerless. We're not powerless. Once you pierce the illusion, we're not powerless, we're powerful. That's the first change, spiritual activism. No, you're not powerless, you're powerful, but you're going to have to be willing to get your fingers dirty. Then you said, we look around the world, we don't see any great leaders. Well, that's kind of offensive, not personally offensive, but like, hello, I was running for president. There are some.
I'm talking about people in power, of course.
Well, hold on a second. Yeah, I understand that, but there are really good people trying to lean against the system in all of these countries. In Germany, I remember how Petra Kelly, I remember how incredibly inspiring she was. There are people in all of these countries, but the people in the spiritual wellness community need to be willing to take a look. In terms of the intention experiment work on that level, of course, and it does go on, Lynn. Nobody has a monopoly on any of this. Everybody it's just a piece of, this is the zeitgeist. So absolutely, I think it's great. I don't think that it can be centralized, but, for instance, you and your work, getting more people to be part of it, but don't think that, oh, nobody's doing anything along this line. We have to work on the bottom and the top, on the inside and the outside. But I think it's also important to realize that, no, we're not powerless. And I think that if we use this kind of thing to, on any level, kind of bolster the belief that we're over here and there's nothing going on out there, it's got to be both and. It's got to be both and. And we're women living in advanced countries. There's a courage element now that, and stop pretending that we're powerless, because we're not, and stop pretending that we don't have the power externally to change things. The women suffragists did sit in small groups and meditate, exactly like you're saying. Their whole thing was Quakerism. Much of what you're talking about is the essence of Quakerism, really, sitting and holding the thought, right? But then they also had to go out and march in the streets as well. And I just think for both of us to hold a both and consciousness is the balance that we need. Like Germaine Greer said, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, it's fraternity. And the opposite of overly externalized modes of change is not overly internalized modes of change. It's a balance between the two. That's how I see it.
Right. Okay. And absolutely right. We have to do both. But it may take a lot of marching in the streets. It may take it. You talked about billions, that we need billions, that people do need, anyone running needs money. That's one of my real worries. And also, just one thing. So suppose that person gets in. What if they have the Congress we're talking about? That Congress is filled with people who have taken
Absolutely.
money
Well,
from,
that's when your attention experiments need to go even more, because it's not like everything will be fine once you elect someone, the president or a prime minister or anything. It's a much bigger, much bigger multidimensional transformation than any one person can bring about. That's
Mhm.
my point. It's got to be both and it's got to be both and for at least the next 20 years for civilization as we know it to even have a chance. I
Yes.
acknowledge you, Lynn. I think that the ideas that you're putting out there are, it's exciting that so many people understand and will participate with you. And so much of what you have revealed, once again, is that line, you can't bring the light to the darkness. You have to bring the darkness to the light. And I know that you've paid a high price at times, and I admire you for continuing to put it out there. And it's an honor to be your friend.
No, and vice versa for you, darling. Listen, do you have time for a couple of questions? I think there's people
Okay,
who put some
just a
questions.
couple. Yeah,
Let's
sure.
see. Let's see a few. Okay. This is a great one for you from Eric. What do you think is the most useful and impactful way to help heal the divide in this country?
In terms of that must be an American speaking.
Yeah.
You know, there's that issue of what happens in the forest, wherever there's a poison, right next to it is the antidote somewhere. I think that everything that we need in order to take the next step that manifests our highest ability to be of service is right in front of us. The issue is to cultivate your own alertness. So to ask yourself where you want to find an alignment between what needs to change and your own skill set and your own desire. And if you sit with that and meditate on that and reflect on that, it'll be right there. Just show up, say, I am willing. One of my favorite gospel songs is Use Me. Just say in whatever way you do to the universe, to God, to source, whatever, use me, and it will appear. And then have the courage and the dedication and the commitment to walk that path, and it will be shown you. Now, probably when I just said that, something already occurred to you. Some phone call you might not have returned, some email that you're thinking, So good on you, just go do it. We need to stop pretending, I don't know what to do. None of this ditzy stuff. You actually do know what to do and you're not doing it yet, or because you don't think it would make a difference or it would be uncomfortable, whatever it is, or just be open. And I promise you ideas will fall in within the next 3 days.
Mhm. Somebody else said, Marge had said, so Summers, what are some focus things we can do on a daily basis? Well, I'll start with that one, which is you can find on my website, lynnmctaggart.com, a whole batch of tools, an entire toolkit that you can do with a Power of 8 group. But I really recommend that that be a starting place for you. You find a group of 8, you can find them on my community site for free, or find 8 friends or whatever, and start small. Do an intention to raise the grade point average in your schools by one point. Do an intention to lower the number of hospital attendees in your hospital. Do an intention to clean up, to lower crime, to clean up your neighborhood. All of those things are intention experiments or Power of 8 groups, and they work. I've had hundreds, thousands of Power of 8 groups who have done just that. One group stopped a fire from flattening the house of one of their members. It went completely around her house, and her house was
Wow.
totally saved. We've
Wow.
seen all kinds of things like that. So it's just starting small, but being an activist, a spiritual activist. It isn't good enough, as Marianne said, to just sit there and say, well, I'll just take care of myself here. We can't.
Well, you know, the Dalai Lama said, in order to change the world or save the world, I think he said, in order to save the world, we have to have a plan, but no plan will work unless we meditate. So I think for me, the Power of Eight, you know, the whole intention is a form of meditation. It's a form of putting your mind on something. And I love that line from the Dalai Lama, because he does talk about the importance of setting your mind in the right place. And of course, don't forget the power of the morning, because when we do whatever that practice is in the morning, it sets your nervous system, the alignment of your consciousness up in such a way as to maximize the probability that the day will unfold according to that intention.
Absolutely. And one of the other things that you can think about with Power of Eight groups is 7/8 of the time you're intending for someone else. And I've done a lot of study into the science of altruism. And it's not just a nice thing to do, it's an essential thing to do. Altruism is like a bulletproof vest. People who do things for other people live longer, healthier, happier lives. It's absolutely irrefutable. And so one of those things, you get into the habit of doing, of service, and that is not just healing for them, it is healing for you. So one of the things that I talk about a lot is that aspect of working in a small group.
You can love the world or you can love 5 people. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there be love there. And in the space of love, or as you were saying, service, miracles happen naturally. The universe self-corrects in the presence of love and service, because it is moving beyond the separation to the realization of our oneness. Anytime we serve, anytime we love, anytime we forgive, we are fortifying the unity and dissolving the separation. And that's when the self-correction occurs. It's beautiful the way all these ideas are just falling down from the sky, literally. The point is for us to embrace them and to make them manifest. And bravo. I hope that all of your intention experiments go exactly the way you're saying, Lynn. And I hope that many people's houses get saved from the fire. I hope that that the world itself be saved from our own self-destructive impulses. God bless you. I've got to go on to my next meeting, but thank you so much for having me for this conversation.
Let everybody know where they can find out more about you, what you're doing next, etc.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, people can find the ideas of my presidential campaign, which are still out there, even though that the campaign has been suspended, at Marianne2024.com. I will begin doing the other side. And once again, this whole person view of my other classes, etc. People can go to Marianne.com and they will be directed to the Marianne Williamson Learning Center. So one way or the other, I'll see you all out there. And thank you so much.
Thank you. And for everybody out there who wants more about me, it's lynnmctaggart.com. Check out my Power of Eight Intention Masterclass if you want to study with me. It kicks off on Saturday, February 17th. So, Marianne, thank you so much for
Thank you, honey. Thank you. Much love to you, Lynn.
Bye-bye. Love to you too. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.